Chapter 5. Fisk, he thought. The anger blossomed inside him, radiating outward until it was hard to remain still. Fisk was in the news a lot, back when he first started Spider-Manning. Peter had been convinced Fisk was, as the tabloids claim, the kingpin of crime, the most ruthless criminals in the city. Sure, Peter was just a high school kid back then, but he'd been driven to prove that he could use his powers responsibly. He made a massive mistake. Soon after he got his spider powers, a frivolous decision not to act when he might have acted, should have acted, and that had led to the death of his Uncle Ben. He'd sworn never again to sit idly when there was something he could do, something that would make a difference. That something had been putting the Kingpin behind bars. Spider-Man had dedicated months of his life toward that one goal. Disrupting Fisk's operations, keeping him off his game, and looking for hard evidence upon which even a bribed or blackmailed district attorney would have to act. Spider-Man had dug up that proof. He collected files, laptops, photographs, and witnesses. He found enough hard evidence to put Fisk in a bespoke orange jumpsuit for life. Back then, it felt like the triumph of a lifetime. He remembered sitting on the couch with Aunt May, shoving a fistful of popcorns into his mouth, while the local news showed Fisk Perp walking to the precinct. You know, Peter, there was a time when I wasn't really sure how to feel about that Spider-Man, Aunt May had told him. But it certainly looks as if he's done the city a real favor. Coming from her, it felt really good. That cocktail of pride and satisfaction and contentment. The sensation of knowing he'd really accomplished something important had been hard to beat. Then life beat it. Life beat it right down and smacked it upside its metaphorical head. Fisk's lawyer went to work, and suddenly half the news outlet in the city were on Fisk's side. It was a setup, they said. Spider-Man was a thug, a criminal himself, and he wanted honest businessmen like Wilson Fisk destroyed so the criminals could have free reign. Evidence went missing, documents vanished or changed, photos were altered, computers records disappeared, witnesses forgot things or remembered entirely new accounts that exonerated Fisk, made him look innocent, made him look like a hero, struggling to save his business while a lawless vandal in a costume tried to tear down everything an honest man had accomplished. Fisk walked. He'd gone right out of the courthouse, and then out of the country too. He's been gone for years too, and maybe that was good enough, Spider-Man had told himself. Sure, it wasn't perfect. No one wanted a guy like Fisk being evil on someone else's turf, but at least Spider-Man has cleaned up his own backyard. If people everywhere did the same, the bad guys would have nowhere to hide. It was weak. Spider-Man knew, but it was all he had. Then, a year ago, Fisk appeared back on the scene, throwing money around, investing in prominent real estate deals, developing long-neglected parts of the city, creating jobs and goodwill. The newspapers were full of stories about the Fisk Foundation, a new charitable effort which was aimed at promoting opportunities for New Yorkers of all incomes. Wilson Fisk was a changed man. He told anyone who would listen, which included a number of journalists whose organization were flush with Fisk money. He'd never been what the vigilantes had claimed. He told them, but he had been selfish and greedy, focused on nothing but his own bottom line. Hardship had taught him the price of selfishness. Now he understood that he had to do good, to do well, and that was why every project he invested in would make the city a little better, improve the lives of its citizens. He didn't want to profit unless others profited too. That was what he claimed, and that was what plenty of people seemed to believe. The truth was, Fisk was back in drugs, extortion, and hijacking and money laundering. All of his old tricks. If it was dirty and violent and profitable, he had his hands in it. Spider-Man knew it, and he wasn't sure he could prove it. But he didn't know if proving it would change a thing. It hadn't last time. I know you've got your own history with that piece of garbage, Watanabe said. That's one of the reasons I'm giving you the benefit of the doubt. I've been trying to build a case against Fisk since he came back on the scene. but I've had to do it on the sly. There are plenty of people above me who don't want Fisk investigated. Fisk always had cops on his payroll. Allegedly, Watanabe said, but her tone made it clear that there was no doubt. Those charges were dropped, remember? You played a pretty big part in his arrest that time. What was that, 5 years ago? 7, Spider-Man said. Right, she said. I guess the question is, what is Fisk after now? Why go to all this trouble? What does setting you up get him? Seems like it's better to focus on catching this impersonator, Spider-Man proposed. Fisk is slippery, and we can worry about his motives later. This bogus Spider-Man, bogus me, might provide all of the answers. Can you ask for a video camera feed from the construction site? We can ask, she said, but if they say no, we'll need a search warrant. And without any evidence of a crime but your word, I don't see that happening. Even if we couldn't get a warrant, it'll take time. Fisk might have had his people erase or alter the feed by then. Why would Fisk even have a secret construction site? Spider-Man asked. Everyone knows he's a real estate developer. This building is nothing but high-end luxury co-ops, Watanabe explained. There's nothing noble about it. Nothing that benefits the common man. It's meant to make a ton of money, so he doesn't want it getting out, since it's not consistent with his new good guy con. None of this tells what he wants. It looks like good old-fashioned revenge to me, Watanabe said. You mess with him, now he's messing with you. You really put the hurt on him back in the day. You gathered a ton of good evidence, but Fisk's lawyer were able to kick up plenty of reasonable doubt, especially with evidence gathered by a guy dressed like a spider. So there's no point in going after him again? I didn't say that, she replied. If you had someone on the inside helping you out, someone who could clean the evidence the way Fisk launders money, things might have turned out differently the first time. I know you costume types are loner, but maybe we could help each other out. This was what he had been waiting to hear. It was a terrific idea, but he didn't want to appear too anxious, so he leaned back and folded his arms. Maybe. I'm usually out of Chinatown. The Hell's Kitchen is short-handed tonight, she said. That clown out there playing some stupid game on his phone isn't my regular partner either, she gestured with her head, looking disgusted. In fact, I think he could be one of those guys in Fisk's pocket, which is why I'm happy to let him play his games on his phone instead of helping me out. I caught this case and the moron will be happy to be off the hook, all of which means I called the shots. I'm going to go on the offensive, argue that we suppress the Spider-Man angle, say the evidence makes it clear, and it does, that this is an imposter looking to stir the pot, and we don't want to play his game. Sooner or later, the guy will have to strike again. And someone else gets killed? Maybe, maybe not, she shrugged. There's no reason to think he'll play the same hand twice. There's also no reason to think he won't use violence again. No matter what we do, our best option is to keep him playing our game rather than having us play his. Meanwhile, you and me, we go after Fisk. Go after him? How? I don't know, she admitted. I need to give this some thought, but you can go places I can't, and I know things that you don't. Your abilities should be able to land us evidence I'd never get my hands on otherwise, and I can turn it into something that will hold up in court. She paused, then added, Let me chew on this for a little while. If you don't like with what I come up with, you can tell me to get lost. But I have a feeling you'd like to see Fisk go down as much as I would. She held out her hand. They shook, and maybe it was just the emotion of the moment, but it felt as if something momentous had just happened. Let's hope we don't make things worse, he said. Watanabe grinned. I can see you're going to be a whole lot of fun to work with. It wasn't even 11 o'clock yet. It felt much later, like the sun should be coming up soon. Peter still hadn't processed everything that had happened. The setup, Andy being murdered, the imposter, and Fisk. It had been a bubbling stew of horribleness. The only bright spot was Lieutenant Watanabe. If she was willing to work with him, and to figure out how they could pool their resources, it might be a chance to set things right. Inside his East Village apartment, Peter navigated the piles of clothes, dirty dishes, stacks of books, and tortuously assembled computer components. The place was cramped, badly maintained, and way too expensive. He was behind with last month's rents and couldn't even bring himself to think about this month's. Living in a shoebox he couldn't afford was just part of the glamour of being a superhero. While he pulled off his suit, he tried to focus his anger in the right direction. Fisk was famous for counterpunching, so it didn't surprise Peter that even after all these years, he'd been looking to get back at Spider-Man. Fisk didn't know how to hurt the man, so he figured he could hurt the image. Peter couldn't worry about reputation, though. He had to focus on doing what he could to help as many people as possible. Uncle Ben had said it himself. With great power, there must also come great responsibility. It was something Peter hadn't considered the night he decided not to stop a thief. The thief who later killed his uncle. They were the words Peter tried to live by now. He had a responsibility to use his abilities the best way he could. He also had a habit of examining everything he did, picking out every move, every decision, to see if he could have done better. Were there better choices he might have made tonight? Choices that might have saved Andy's life? Peter thought he'd done what seemed to be right at the time, not knowing that he'd been set down onto the board of a bigger game. If Fisk was involved, though, he couldn't afford to let his guard down. Not again. Fisk was as corrupt as they came, and Peter couldn't change that. He could, however, stop him, and that meant doing everything in his power to make it happen. First things first, though. What he needed more than anything was to see MJ. She always talked him down, helped him feel better. She wasn't answering her phone again, though, so he figured he should go out and look for her. Turning on the shower, he took a cautionary sniff at the suit. There was a tear, a souvenir of the fight with his opponent. He needed to fix that. It was starting to get a little rank, too, but cleaning it was complicated and time-consuming. It'd have to wait. Fortunately, the outer layers were scent-proof, which meant that, for now, he'd be the only one who would have to live with the funk. When he took it off, however, the sweat seemed to rise from his body in undulating waves. I, he thought, am gross. Even if Peter had examined himself closely to a mirror, he wouldn't have seen the tiny patch, no bigger than a thumbnail, stuck to his lower back. From the moment his attacker had torn through his suit and attached it to his skin, it had begun to blend in, matching itself to its surrounding in color and texture. It didn't come off in the shower either. It had its limitations, though. It would dry up and peel off in a few days. In the meantime, it would transmit its data. It was 11:37, and Peter still hadn't made contact with MJ. He knew it was foolish to worry, but he worried anyhow. That was part of the package, and MJ knew it. Peter had lost his parents when he was very young, and that had impressed upon him the fragility of the world. He lost his Uncle Ben because of his own foolish choices. That had only made the feelings more intense. He did everything he could to keep his identity a secret. No matter what, he had to keep MJ, Aunt May, and all of his friends out of the crosshairs. The possibility haunted him every day, though. No matter how careful he was, someone might learn who he was and use the people he cared about as leverage. Or worse. So of course he worried. More than that, he wanted to talk to the only person who knew his secret, telling her about the things that had happened that night. MJ rented an apartment near Washington Square Park, and he had the key. He let himself in, but only to make sure that the legendary night owl hadn't surprised him by going to sleep early. No luck there, though. So he considered his options. He might call their mutual friend Harry Osborn. The three of them had been a team for years. And sometimes MJ told Harry things she didn't tell Peter. She said it was because Peter tended to worry. Objectively, he understood, yet it bothered him. Mostly because he was a warrior. This, he knew, was a vicious cycle. Besides, if MJ was going to confide in anyone, Peter wanted to be Harry. He was smart, insightful, and all around a good person. He also had a lot more free time than Peter. Unlike some people who, say, labored all day in a lab and then swung around the city half the night as Spider-Man, Harry had the advantage of a rich father. It was an advantage Peter knew that Harry would have traded away in an instant. Harry had long resisted working for Oscorp, his father's company. He'd briefly been willing to work on a pet project for his mother, but that hadn't satisfied Norman Osborn. Then again, he was never satisfied. Now Osborn was mayor of New York City, and that might have been a blessing. Running the city meant Norman didn't have as much time to harangue his son, pressing Harry to do something with his life. He'd become a part-time thorn in his son's side. So growing up rich had to come with its own burdens. Though Peter might have been willing to bear burdens like that, still, he thought he understood. He'd always been hungry to achieve great things, to make his own way in the world. Often it felt like thrashing around in a storm-tossed sea, struggling just to survive. Yet, how do you motivate yourself when no matter what happened, you knew you were going to be okay? Again, problems Peter wouldn't mind sampling, but he knew Harry's struggles were real. His friend had scheduled an upcoming trip to Europe, and he hoped some time away would help him out. Harry wanted to travel, to see the world, to consider his options. He said he'd be touring some of the European Oscorp facilities, but that was to placate his father. What Harry really wanted was to get some distance from his father, and to get his head together. Sure enough, Harry was home. It just proved that he really had no idea what he wanted, or how to get it. Harry was a good-looking 22-year-old heir to billions alone in his apartment on a Saturday night, reading medical journals. Sure, he'd never really been a party boy, but this was dreary even by Harry's standards. "You thinking about medical school?" Peter asked as he took a seat. Harry's apartment was 4 times the size of Peter's and furnished with things people bought in actual stores. Truth be told, though, Peter had a certain fondness for New York's curbside treasures, the thrill of the hunt and all. Harry shrugged as he poured Peter a glass of flavored seltzer. "Just considering my options." Peter took the glass as Harry sat down from him. It had to be hard in its own way. Much of Peter's life had been dictated by what he felt like he had to do. To use his abilities wisely, to learn as much as he could, to pay the rent, to avoid disappointing the people who cared about him. Perhaps it was paralyzing, having everything handed over on a silver platter. "Maybe you could look at some med schools in Europe." "Maybe," Harry replied noncommittally. Then he laughed. "Listen, Pete, stop pretending. I know perfectly well why you're here," he said. "We've been friends for a long time, so you're not going to hurt my feelings. You want to know where MJ is." "She's not answering her phone," Peter admitted sheepishly. "And it's late." "Maybe for an old lady like you." "Says the guy who's reading medical journals on a Saturday night." "Touché," Harry replied. "Then again, what have you been up to that's so interesting? Wherever MJ is, why aren't you with her?" There it was. Peter hated it. He considered many times to tell Harry the truth, but he'd never been able to bring himself to do it. It wasn't that he didn't trust Harry. He trusted him completely. It always came down to the fact that he didn't have to tell him. He could be friends with Harry and not tell him, and that kept both of them a little safer. There was part of him as well that worried that somehow, if he told Harry, Norman Osborn might find out. Harry might let something slip, or talk in his sleep. Something. Anything. He might let out a fraction of the truth, and then the relentlessly clever Norman Osborn would piece together the rest. It wasn't that Peter thought Norman was bad, but he wasn't exactly good either. He liked power a little too much. Why else would a guy at the helm of one of the most successful companies in the world decide he had to be mayor of one of the most important cities in the world? It was ego, Peter thought. Pure and simple. If there was a prize out there, Norman Osborn couldn't resist grabbing it, doing whatever he could to be the best, the most important, the most influential. "I've been, working at the lab," Peter lied. There were some time-sensitive experiments. It was a classic from his bag of excuses. Harry never seemed to suspect, in part because there had been plenty of times when Peter really had gotten wrapped up in a time-sensitive experiments. As the son of a scientist and inventor, Harry understood it all too well. "Yeah, You're living the wild life, Harry said. How can I compete? Look, if you're teasing me this much, it means you know where MJ is and just wants to make me suffer. Maybe a little, Harry admitted. Plus, I didn't want you to go all protective when you found out that she's in Hell's Kitchen. She's what? Peter said. By herself? At night? Easy, Lancelot, Harry said, and he laughed. She can take care of herself, and you know it. He did. If Peter hadn't been augmented by spider powers, MJ could have beaten him up while checking her email. She studied martial arts for years, and on a few harrowing occasions, she proved she knew how to practice what she preached. Logically, Peter pitied the poor guy who tried to take her purse. But emotionally, he wanted to be there to keep it from happening. It's an audition piece for the Bugle, Harry said. She's doing some kind of feature on people who work late-night shifts. I forgot the specifics. That sounds interesting, Peter replied, trying to play it cool. Maybe I should pay her a visit, see if I can lend her a hand. Give her the benefit of the years of journalistic experience, you know. As a photographer, Harry smirked. What sort of hand do you think you can lend her? Peter opened his mouth, but couldn't think of anything to say. Relax, dude, Harry laughed again. She told me to let you know if you happen to drop by. Then why didn't she just tell me herself? Because if she did, then she knew you'd have to check on her. He gave Peter a look. Maybe she knew about your time-sensitive experiments and didn't want you to feel obligated. Trying not to seem too eager, Peter got Harry to give him the address. They talked a little longer, as little as he could manage, and said goodnight, agreeing to get together soon. Then Peter left. He wasn't wearing his suit, so Peter took a cab he couldn't afford and found MJ right where Harry said she would be. It was an all-night grocery in Hell's Kitchen where she was finishing up an interview with the owner, a shy and polite man named Danilo Ocampo. Ocampo was an immigrant from the Philippines. He'd been working 18 hours for the past 10 years and in spite of owning his own business, was still having a hard time making ends meet. Like the other people she'd been interviewing, he won a lottery that wouldn't let him live in a new Fisk apartment complex at affordable rates. The piece she was writing was about how Fisk Real Estate Ventures was going to change the lives of ordinary New Yorkers. Fisk, Peter snapped. Are you kidding me? These days, Fisk's name was everywhere. The media loved his riches to rags to riches angle. Though Peter suspected the kingpin never lost his fortune, just did a good job of hiding it. Suddenly, he was New York's most benevolent businessman, putting up huge buildings full of luxury apartments mixed with equally spacious subsidized units, paying his workers well above standard wages, developing projects designed to attract jobs to the city. In truth, the Fisk way was theft on a grand scale, drug dealing, human trafficking, extortion, and money laundering for some of the most dangerous criminals in the world. The Fisk way was power and corruption and acquisition at any cost. How can you agree to do a puff piece on that guy? Peter asked. I know what Fisk is, MJ whispered. But this is a good story. It could get me the job at the Bugle, and then I'll stick with it. Because if I cover Fisk, even if it's from a features perspective, I might dig up the proof that pokes a hole in the PR balloon. Peter thought back to what he learned from Lieutenant Watanabe, that Fisk was still developing high-end real estate, only hiding it behind shell corporations. A story like that could expose the hypocrisy of the new Fisk, but it might also risk Watanabe's sources. Worse, it could put MJ in Fisk's crosshair, and there was no way he was going to do that. Taking MJ by the arm, he gently led her outside. What he had to say next might elicit a loud reaction, and he didn't want that to happen in front of the smiling Mr. Ocampo. They stepped off to one side, out of the pool of light that came from the grocery. You do not want to cross Fisk, Peter said. You don't even want him to wonder if you might be thinking of crossing him. Best of all, you don't want him to know you exist. A guy like that won't hesitate to have a journalist killed. She glared at him for a moment before responding. What, you can take all the risk you want, but I can't? MJ asked. Is this the way it works now? Because it's the first I've heard about it. I'm not saying that, he groaned. I'm just saying you could focus on other kinds of story for the moment. That's all. Like dog shows, she suggested. And the latest app craze? Come on, MJ. No, you come on, she said, poking him in the chest. She was so intense that he felt a buzzing in the back of his head. I'm applying for the features job just because that's where there's an opening. But my goal, my real goal, is investigative reporting. Once they see what I can do, I'll have a shot at it. This is my calling, Peter. It's what I want to do. It's how I can make a difference. You of all people have to understand, and you can't seriously tell me not to follow my dream. He sighed. No, I can't. I wouldn't. I shan't. That seemed to do it. She took a step back and smiled at him. Look, I know you're worried, she said. I worry about you too, but I learned how to deal with it. Now you're going to have to learn to live with it too. Suddenly, Peter realized that the buzzing hadn't stopped. There was a scrape of shoe against pavement. What a sweet couple of lovebirds. He turned and there was a man standing there. He looked like every other passerby. Cotton shirt, jeans, a jacket, and a switchblade? Hand over your wallets, he said. Jewelry too. You don't want to do this, MJ said, smiling sweetly. Just walk away, turn your life around. Don't tell me what That was as far as he got because MJ's knee had made contact with his groin. Though it was hardly necessary, as he fell to the sidewalk, she added a kick. Then she leaned over him as he squirmed on the ground. Remember, crime doesn't pay, she told him as she scooped up his knife, closed it, and dropped it into her purse. Then she looked over at Peter. Good thing you were here to save me. Peter gave her a wry grin. Point taken.